I think the Wall Street is totally misreading Washington. It's pricing in a fantasy about a Trump stimulus that simply isn't going to happen. There will be no big tax cut. There will be no $15 or $20 a share reduction in the corporate rate. Infrastructure stimulus.
David, how do you know that?
Because we're heading into a debt ceiling trap that will grind the whole system to a halt by June or July. People are forgetting we've been on debt ceiling holiday. That holiday ends
right. Well, that's
March.
not necessarily new to Donald Trump. That's
no, it is totally
from the predecessor.
It's totally new to Donald Trump. He tweeted last weekend that he had reduced the debt by $12 billion. It's actually up $187 billion in the first 35 days that he's been in office. The cash on the Treasury's balance sheet, and this is the key point I'm trying to get to, was $382 billion the day he was sworn in last Friday. It was $178 billion. It's bled $200 billion of cash, a fifth of a trillion, while he didn't even have his economic team in place. When they get to March 15 and the debt ceiling freezes at $20 billion, or $20 trillion, they'll have maybe $200 billion of cash. That is being run out, $3 to $4 to $5 billion a day. By June, it will be gone, and there is no pathway, I will assert, to a majority in the House or Senate to pass a debt ceiling increase in the trillions in order to make any of this stuff possible.
Well, that's what I wanted to ask you, and let me just respectfully push back here. I'm not taking a side either way, but some would argue that Trump's whole negotiation tactic, it all resides on what we've seen from him in the past. For example, his book, The Art of the Deal, how he comes to the table to put a deal together. He's also leveraged himself before. Could it be that he's looking at a different way of running the system than we've seen before?
He might be, but that makes it even more dangerous and reckless. This isn't Atlantic City casinos in the junk bond market in 1991. This is the big time. This is $20 trillion of debt, and this is a House Republican majority that doesn't exist. That's a delusion. It's a gang of factions. They're already beginning to splinter and fracture as a result of the Obamacare repeal and replace, which, by the way, is going to spill much blood over the next 3 or 4 months, and they won't even get to tax reform before the debt crisis hits. We will have a government shutdown. It is totally unexpected, unpriced in, as they say by Wall Street. It will spook everybody, and Trump is so reckless that this could go on for days or weeks or months in a way that we've never seen before. The 2/11 crisis with Obama will be a Sunday school picnic compared to what's likely coming down the pike. So the speech Tuesday night was irrelevant. Besides that, it was the most irresponsible fiscally speech given by a president since, LBJ talked about guns and butter. How can he possibly raise defense by $50 billion, more for veterans, the $1 trillion, infrastructure program, more for education, medical credits, all the rest, and then cut taxes by $3 to $5 trillion, which he also promised? This is
David,
complete madness, I'll tell you.
Let's talk about the markets for a minute, because he is taking credit for the run that the Dow has had here, and a lot of people are saying that's a big mistake.
I think he'll rue the day he took credit. You should never predicate what you're trying to do for the long run, as well as intended as he might be, on what the robo-machines are doing in the short run, and that's clearly what's running today. The robo-machines can read words, and therefore when he speaks, they hit the buy key, but they can't read the tea leaves in Washington because it's far more complex, far more opaque than the stimulus the machines are used to. The stimulus the machines are used to comes from the Fed. The Fed is simple, transparent, stupid, and predictable. Washington is absolutely the opposite. They think the baton is being handed off to fiscal, and it is not going to happen.
Brian wants to jump in here, David.
Okay.
Okay, so, hi, Brian Stutland here. So
yeah, Brian,
here's the one question. 2012 to 13, we had the fiscal cliff worry, and we had a House divided. We had Republicans in Congress, we had a Democratic president, and yet they somehow managed to raise the debt ceiling and get through that time. Why do you not think, when you have a Republican Congress, a Republican president, that we just simply won't raise the debt ceiling, figure that problem out, and yes, maybe we'll live in a higher interest rate environment because it's going to be more expensive to borrow money, but why can't that happen?
Because you now have a Republican president and a Republican House that is not about to start a bipartisan negotiation like Obama did with Boehner. The reason that the Freedom Caucus exists today and that the Tea Party is still half of the back benches is they believe they were sold out time after time after time by Boehner and the Republican leadership, and that's how they passed the debt ceiling. Now, Trump has declared war on the Democrats. He's declared war on the border, on immigrants, the deportations, all the rest of it. The Democrats are not going to deliver any votes, in my view, for a debt ceiling increase unless he throws in the towel on Obamacare and on border control and all the rest of it, which he won't do because he would have a revolt on the right. The politics today are 3 times more fraught than they were in any of the years that you mentioned when we barely got through in prior terms.
All right, David, final question to you. You say the market's going lower from here. How much lower?
Who knows? I think there is a massive fantasy built in that an economy 92 months into an expansion, almost the longest in history, can suddenly get up on its hind legs and start growing again. Profits are still down. You know, they're in the last 12 months, they're still about 10 or 12% below the peak in September 2014. I see nothing to reaccelerate the economy or profits, and I see a huge mess, bloodbath, fiscal stalemate in Washington that will remove any of the stimulus that the traders are expecting from infrastructure and big tax cuts and all the rest.
All right, David Stockman, thank you so much for calling in. We'll talk to you again soon.
And joining us right now to talk about it is former Reagan budget director David Stockman. And David, we have not seen a tax overhaul since your days overhauling the tax in the Reagan days.
Yeah, but there's a big difference. Okay. The national debt was $1 trillion then. It's $20 trillion today. When we got out of control, which happened in 1981, the tax cut became much bigger than intended. There was a budget surplus by the middle of the decade that we could cut. Today, they're facing $10 trillion of built-in debt before you even approach what Trump talked about the other night. I have to say, that speech was the most fiscally irresponsible speech given to the Congress since LBJ's, guns and butter.
What was so irresponsible about it?
He's going to raise defense. He's going to raise veterans. He's going to more for borders, more for education, the medical credit. On top of that, a massive tax cut for the middle class, a huge, big reduction in corporate taxes. The numbers don't even close to add up.
Well, maybe, but Steven Mnuchin, the Treasury Secretary, came on with us last week and basically walked us through some of the ideas that the president has been considering. One of them is this idea of a reciprocal tax, which would raise more than $1 trillion, just like a border adjustment tax. Listen to Steven Mnuchin, who joined us just on last Sunday.
An idea that he's looking at calling a reciprocal tax, which is basically saying we want to create a level playing field so that other countries treat us the way we're treating them. We're not going to get into trade wars, but what we are going to do is the president believes in free trade, but he believes in fair trade.
What about that? I mean, what about the idea to raise revenue, some kind of a tax at the border?
Yeah, I'm for a border adjustment tax. It's highly controversial. It'll take 2 years to get through the Congress at best. But before then, they're going to have the mother of all debt ceiling crises. I don't know why people can't see this. The debt.
We're not talking about this. This is coming up in a week and a half.
This is coming up closely. First of all, the president is totally misinformed and unprepared about the debt. He said the other day it's down 12 trillion or billion on his watch so far. Actually, in the first 35 days, the net debt was up $187 billion. He had $382 billion of cash the day he was sworn in. It's down to $178 billion now. They've burned through $200 billion of cash in the first 35 days.
How did they do that?
Because the government is still that far in deficit, and when the debt ceiling freezes in, when the holiday ends on March 15th, the clock will start ticking, and by the day, people will begin to realize they're going to run out of cash by June or July. A huge showdown is coming, and there is no pathway to a majority in the House or Senate to raise the debt ceiling by trillions. And that will back up everything. That Obamacare repeal and replace is turning into a catastrophe.
By the way, that's why they have to do tax reform during reconciliation. So because you'll get 51 votes. They need 51 votes versus the 60. That's why we're not going to see tax reform until after the summertime.
That's right. But to get the reconciliation,
go back, yeah.
They need a budget resolution for the next fiscal year,
right.
fiscal 18. But they have to have a debt ceiling increase before then.
So the debt ceiling deadline is March 15th.
The debt ceiling freezes in. Right now it's on holiday. They can borrow anything they want. On March 15, it'll freeze in at $20 trillion. There'll be $200 billion of cash on the balance sheet. It's going to dissipate by the day. When they get to zero cash, no borrowing authority, then where do they get a majority? The Freedom Caucus, Tea Party Republicans are not going to vote for a multi-trillion tax debt ceiling increase before they've repealed Obamacare.
Wow.
The Democrats are not going to help Trump as long as he is slamming their constituencies and putting up walls at the borders.
Well, they're not going to help him regardless. Come on,
they're not going to help.
They ran out like 3 seconds after he said,
point.
God bless America, the other night.
And this is my point, though. The market is totally missing the fact that the tax cut isn't going to happen, that instead there's going to be this terrible showdown on the debt ceiling that will create a panic and sell-off like we haven't seen before. So yesterday, was tulip bulb time. It was irrational exuberance on steroids, and this isn't going to last once it becomes clear that the clock is ticking on the debt ceiling.
Wow, it sounds like you would be selling into this 303 rally.
It would be a perfect time to sell.
A perfect time to sell, huh? All right, now, the president also discussed some of the ideas about replacing Obamacare and talked about this timeline, Obamacare. First, he also talked about continuing to provide tax credits to help people buy insurance. What do you make of that in terms of the Obamacare part of the story?
Well, I've looked at the Ryan outline. It's Obamacare light. It does not fundamentally change direction. The Medicaid expansion stays in place. They just lower the matching rate. Instead of tax credits based on income, they're based on age. They're refundable. They're a new entitlement. The conservative Republicans are properly concerned about this. The whole cost of the Medicaid plus the tax credits is $6 trillion over the next 10 years, and that will not change hardly at all with the Ryan plan. And that's where they're starting. By the time they round up a majority, the Ryan plan will be Obamacare light, and I doubt whether they'll get the conservative Republicans to vote for it. That's why I say everything is going to break down in Capitol Hill. They need to focus on what's happening on the ground up there, not down here in the canyons of Wall Street.
What can the president learn from Reaganomics?
I think he can learn that he's in a different world. As I said before, he's inheriting $20 trillion of debt, 10 more trillion in the pipeline. It's 106% of GDP. He has no flexibility, and if he thinks he can duplicate what Ronald Reagan did accidentally, there was a huge kind of Keynesian stimulus from these big deficits in the mid-'80s because he inherited a balance sheet that was clean. The debt was 30% of GDP. There was plenty of room to borrow. Donald Trump ought to recognize he is not the second coming of Ronald Reagan. He's inheriting 30 years. He's in a giant debt trap, and he has to stop promising all kinds of things that he absolutely cannot deliver.
Well, it sounds like you are not feeling good about anything that's going on right now at all, David.
No, I'm not, because there is a collision. You can hear the sound of the collision happening on Capitol Hill right now. It's splintering everywhere.
What about the idea that growth is going to cure a lot of these ills?
Well, the
Once
idea...
you start getting 4% growth...
Well, they said you'd get 4% growth if you get this giant tax cut through funded by more deficits.
Rollback regulations also supposed to help the growth
That'll
story.
help in the long run. In the short run, it won't, it won't impact very much at all.
All right, warning signs from David Stockman.